So that said, man, this is a long prelude, but I think it's important to understand the foundations, because again, often we interact with mission leaders or ministry leaders, and we where they are at a point in time, and we experience that dynamic, but seeing the journey that informs it is not a discipline we often take. And so I think that that's an important, it's not really a prelude to foundation. We'll call it that. So talk about the launch of servant leaders, and then the team, what it looks like, the scope of what you're doing, and kind of how you got there.
Okay. So when we initially launched it, it was all based on an educational model. So the focus was, again, what I didn't want to do, but God in his providence, he moves us in a way that, when you get there, you're like, oh, okay. I would have said no 2 years ago. Now you have me in that place and I'm open and saying yes. It was based on a desire to help the church have the resources. First and foremost, the resources to train up their people from A to Z. So one of the struggles we always faced in missions was, how do I take this guy who's a new believer, first generation Christian, and move him to pastoring in a period of time that's obviously doesn't outlive myself. So I want to do this as efficiently, as quickly as possible. Where do I get the resources for that? Where do I get the patterns and the models and the understanding? I had gone back to school while we were in Costa Rica. I think it took me 10 years to finish my master's, but the whole focus was organizational leadership, to try to understand the development, systems, all that stuff, what it would take to track with somebody internally in the local church. And so at this period of time, it was all about, this is one big sandbox. We're moving pieces around. We don't have a clue. We're doing our best. And so we're conducting local church-based training. We're making available resources, classes, books to local church leadership to help them understand what this looks like theologically, what this looks like philosophically, and then to assist them and push them into a space to help them conduct it at their local church. And so at that period of time, I think we're a team of 3 missionaries that came together to accomplish that. And as that grew and that we began to see a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel and fruit in our fellowship with these pastors and these churches, we began to formulate a model that was very different than what we originally started with. Originally started with modules, very traditional. We would go in and conduct a module for you. We'll provide the training. We'll take you in the resources. Hopefully you'll reproduce this down the road. But that was it. And then we came up to a point where we were like, this is not what we want to do. This is not truly effective.
And so talk real quick about the 3 M's, right? Is it 3 M's?
Mm-hmm. So when we began to see that the model of modules wasn't working, that's when we began to understand that, okay, the traditional mentality of the American missionary is to educate, right? To come down and instruct. And so we gathered people together. Sometimes we gathered pastors and church people. Our focus was still local church, so we were trying to always focus in on the members of the church versus going into an area and bringing pastors together. But even in doing that, we were high on the education on the mind, and so we were dumping a massive amount of information in a week-long process. You were there for one of those in Northern Ecuador. We did Old Testament, right? So we're dumping all this information, and after a while, we recognized, man, these people are like retaining 60% if we're fortunate. And so we stepped back from that model and said, this is not working. We need to focus it on really the head, hand, and hearts of the issue. We need to obviously have instruction from the word, but we can't move people beyond their character. So there needs to be character formation. There needs to be somebody who's digging deep and helping the word have an effect on the heart, and a place where people can truly work out the activities that they're being challenged to do. So it's a Philippians 4 activity. What you've heard, what you've seen, Paul lays that out, these processes. So head, hand, and hearts. And so our 3 M's were mentor, mobilize, and multiply. So we need to mentor, instruct. So mentoring has a piece of instruction. It has a piece of modeling or character formation, and it has a piece of unleashing and helping people begin to experiment at the local church level these new gifts and abilities that God is giving and forming in them, and then being able to mobilize them into ministry, because you have to have a process and an understanding that you're trying to unleash people into ministry. You're trying to open up doors for them to experiment that at the local church level, and then feel comfortable doing that, so that if you get to the point where you can, number one, multiply that process inside, so mentor, mobilize, and multiply that internally so it's perpetual, then you can also multiply your efforts outside. And so you can send people out of strength, not that eventual, one and out volunteer that says, "Hey, I feel called to go." You're like, "Oh, what a surprise!" No, you're truly moving people into a process, and you're bleeding out your best.
Yeah. Well, and over the years I think that initial conversation in Grand Rapids 10 years ago, the question was, hey, can we align and build out a baseline curriculum for kind of that module format that mirrors at that point our grow system. There were some
Mm-hmm.
the levels really lined up well, and there was some cross DNA there. And that was the first project. And part of my favorite part of that project was actually having the grow system translated and then dubbing my
Dubbed
dad and
into
Dwight.
Spanish, right?
Yes, still
Right,
my favorite thing
right.
ever, and especially when you watch it on 1.5 times, it's hilarious. Um, Great stuff. If nothing else came out of it, I got that entertainment value. But we did that, and then not real far, few years down the road, as you mentioned, I went with you and Derek to Ecuador, Quito, and Cuenca, and in the region there, and just sat alongside as you did your thing with guys like Darwin and Jose and Wilmer, and just
Mm-hmm.
watched these different local churches in the different regions do their thing, but also take in this training. And one of the things that was interesting, there's two things for me that came out of that. And I know I've shared this with you, but I'll just kind of recap real quick. One was watching the people that were sitting in those seminars learn, and the before and the after. In other words, before, when everybody showed up, they are just chattering and loving on each other with real relationship. Like you just feel the level of connection relationship. But as soon as class started, it's like everybody just kind of snapped into note taking mode, and wanting all the information and stuff. Like they had
Right,
been trained to learn a certain way, or to kind of
right,
absorb information a certain way. And then as soon as class is done, they're back to like connecting in their natural dynamic. As the contrast there was really interesting to me. And as I started thinking about learning dynamics, I thought, I wonder how much of their learning style, or what they think is, or what they've been trained to think is learning, is taught, not actually how they learn and develop. Um, from a school standpoint, from a church standpoint, the difference between content, context, all that stuff. So that was one kind of open question as I was watching across these different dynamics. The second one that really marked our path moving forward was as we were getting ready to fly out, Cesar at the airport looked at me directly and said, "Hey, would you consider? We really need this university, these degrees, certificates, et cetera. We need this training at this next level. Um, I, would you consider?" Or I don't remember
right,
if he used the word promise, because somebody was
right,
translating
right.
for me.
Remember that.
Um, Partnering with us in that way. And I remember just having to reflect on that and say, okay, what does this look like? Because it felt really big to me. Felt not just foreign, but also I had such a deep appreciation for what God was doing, and the foundational work, and for the relationship servant leaders had with each of those ministries. Was not, we are the missionaries and we run stuff. It was very much brotherhood alongside coaching and mentoring, and you could see those relationships. And you could see the way that you guys cared for those relationships in that order, as alongside, not over top. And I remember thinking, man, how would we partner in a way that doesn't just leverage on that, but actually amplifies that, because the mission for Anchor Christian University amplified the disciple making mission of the local church globally. And we had not yet done that globally at that point. So those were two things that then I think as we started exploring moving forward, those two moments on that trip that really marked me thinking through that stuff. So moving forward, you from the States launched Servant Leaders as a team, in a team model. Servant Leaders runs in a team model, and at the same time not just maintain, but came alongside relationships that had already been built, and more that kind of expanded through churches in Latin America in that alongside model, that training and equipping model. How early on it was relationships that you had, and it was three of you guys. Talk about the trajectory from that seed to where you're at now, from a team dynamic perspective, the things that you're doing, et cetera.
So in the beginning, we were underneath another institution, another missions organization. Then in 2016, we launched as a nonprofit, as a 501c3. And at that point in time, a huge amount of risk for some of us, especially myself, to step out into that, disconnecting from something known, the coverage, everything. We were out on our own. And that was super, super scary period of time. And still with a lot of question marks of defining philosophy, trying to decide where do we put our stake down in all this. And so we launched as a nonprofit, begin this idea of how do we best move away from the module mentality. Our desire was to go in and impact the DNA of the church and change some theology, but also some philosophy, so that when we go and would do a module and leave, it was done, and there was nobody to perpetuate that. But how do we go in, impact them at the base level, so this is something that moves beyond us? And I think that's where the light went on with Grow. And so the idea of the transformation cycle, the idea of the foundation to everything that we're doing is found in the church's competency of being able to have a solid base of people who understand progressive sanctification and that Jesus Christ is their principal discipler. And so the idea that we would go in now and lay a foundation that would give us a platform to build on really helped change everything. And so partnering with you guys, translating all of that material, beginning to run that virtually online. We created our own online platform, a learning management system that was exclusively for us. That was very interesting. And we began to test the waters of using technology to partner with local churches, to give them that technology, to help them push it into local churches. And especially, we're talking about local churches in the developing world. So that had its own challenges. We began to grow our team. More people began to come on board to desire to see the same thing happen. And so we saw something begin to take place that we didn't intend in the beginning. So strategically, it wasn't like we had a 5-year, 10-year plan for servant leaders. It was kind of like it was more pragmatic, and that's very dangerous, but it was more pragmatic in the beginning. And then God continued to move us more towards formality, which is very dangerous, because we decided we don't want to be a brick and mortar institution. We don't want to be legacy driven. We don't care if we last 3 years or 10 years. We want to, when we're done, like God crumbles up and throw us away, because the church doesn't need us anymore. But we don't want to overtake the church and what the church is supposed to be doing. So there's that tension, that fine line of, hey, we don't want to do for you what you should be doing for yourself, but we will assist you in the meantime to create tools to help that. So that expanded us beyond creating courses, partnering with Anchor. We had the Grow material as a foundation to us moving forward. We created 25 other courses, multiple certificates to be able to go into the church and say, we want to train you to use this. Use it, and you can modify it, you can tweak it, you can make it your own. We don't want you to put on our shirt. We want you to gain a confidence that you can do this on your own. That moved us out into a space where we began to experiment with online training, like I said, with our own learning management system, and then came on board with you guys, where Anchor was gracious enough to give us space in the architecture to be able to train people online through a more formal setting. This was all pre-COVID. We're talking, this was like 2017. We really began to formalize this. 2018 got some momentum. So when COVID hit, we were already moving. We were already cruising with that in Latin America. And also we took on more opportunities to help mobilize people into ministry. So as we partnered deeply with churches, they began to ask the question, will you help us mobilize our people outside of the church? Which means that we need somebody to help us organize the funding, which I was like in the beginning stages, no, there ain't no way we're doing that. So how do you receive funds? How do you remit funds? How do you organize that and I'm not an operation guy, so anything that has details in it, I curl up and panic. And so to think about receiving support and organizing support operationally and then remitting that in multiple countries, that was like keep you up at night stuff. And so we looked at opportunities to partner with multiple ministries that already did that. So we didn't have to do that, but we just couldn't create it. It didn't work. Partly because all those other ministries have a high level of infrastructure and they take great amounts of funds out of those support checks. And we didn't want to do that. We wanted to provide the greatest amount of service with the lowest amount of price. And so one of our team members came on board that had already been there for a couple of years and helped us build a learning management system. He took on the endeavor to help organize the infrastructure to receive, to account for, to organize, and then to remit those funds internally. So we took on a whole nother level of infrastructure, at the same time trying to stay decentralized. That wasn't the tail that wagged the dog, but just was another tool in our toolbox that we could offer and provide, but not something that identified us as principally driven by that. So we started to build that, bringing on people. We started remitting funds to, I think, 5 different countries. We took on W-2 employees, which in multiple states in the United States. So how to deal with tax reasons and learn all of this in that process of how do you stay within the lanes with the IRS, and how do you partner with people in multiple countries and not be audited by the IRS or be viewed as in those countries as, you're doing something illicit. So we've had to learn all that in the process.
So and at this point, how many American missionaries do you have? And then also how many team members internationally are part of servant leaders?
So we're 21 families right now. And we have Americans that are, let's say, W-2, let's do it that way. So they're employees, quote unquote. We have, I believe there's 6 of us that are W-2 employees right now. And then we have multiple, our team consists of members from 4 different countries right now, nationalities. We are in multiple countries, but if you look at the dynamic of our team, the majority of our team members speak Spanish, not English. But we have some team members that are in Europe, for example, that don't speak Spanish. So we have that dynamic now. We have Spanish-speaking only members, English-speaking only members, some bilingual. So we're also managing that dynamic.
Awesome. So I think I'd love to take another hour, but that's not healthy for a podcast episode.
They'll turn us off.
But thinking about where servant leaders is at, you've got these toolboxes now, all these elements that have been developed. You've got a growing team. One of the dynamics that I think is the most intriguing to me is even the American team members are not traditional missionaries downrange doing things the way traditional missionaries do. Everything is aimed at train. Did you say supposed to be?
Yes, supposed to be.
So everything is aimed at raising up and training and releasing and encouraging people to do ministry in local churches as teams where they're at, where God called them, that frontline ministry. And I think from a DNA perspective, even the transition to doing the digital platform training, saying we're not going to step in and become the solution so much as help you develop what it is that God's doing there. All of those things are really tightly aligned. And that's why, over the last 10 years, as we've taken each step, I think both of us are reasonably entrepreneurial and willing to say, my saying is always, if we do what we do at 80% of what we're capable of doing, we're still, way beyond some of the other models that are out there and approaches that are out there. We're still producing elite results in what we're aiming for. And we're willing to take the process in stages, as long as God is moving people towards what their purpose is, what He built them for, in churches and whatnot. And so that alignment's been there since the beginning. And as we've kind of discovered, one of my great joys in leading Anchor Christian University is the opportunity to highlight not what we've built in Latin America, but what the Latin Americans have built with the tools and infrastructure that we have been able to resource them with. Vanessa, who just transitioned out, Vanessa Cordero, really ran Anchor U, AMPLA, Latin America for several years, and she just transitioned out, and now we've got new leadership being handed off in Nicaragua, from Ecuador to Nicaragua. And I look at that and I say, we knew from the beginning that it was going to take years and there were going to be stages of this thing. But to be this far down the road and see the fruit of that manifest, and even be handed off from initial generation to the next from a leadership perspective, I love that, because for servant leaders and for 11.6 Anchor U, it's evidence of the mission actually working itself out under the Lord's direction and with His resources over time. So talk just a little bit, like we're gonna hit this, and then I've got one other question for you as it relates to just advice for others kind of following in path. But talk a little bit about what Anchor U Latin America looks like, infrastructure, where it's at now, and then where it's headed. And then at some point we'll pull David on and figure out how to do a translated podcast episode.
I think part of the beauty of Anchor has always been its focus. You're at the core of the desire to get local church-based training going. Obviously, you're in other venues, but that's a real heart desire, and it matched up with our desire in spaces and places where it was easiest because there aren't any really solid institutions, but also, creating momentum because you have architecture and infrastructure that, we could partner and build off of. And so for Latin America, you guys gave us the ability to really release ownership. It was our desire to not be bogged down by infrastructure or philosophical tendencies of, missions for a lot of years where we create and we own, but rather to say, and again, not even creating franchises, right? But rather say, we want this to be something that's dispersed. And it, obviously making reference to what you said before about countries in Latin America being very different. And as you disperse it, having the freedom and the liberty to make it something that's culturally adaptable and not rigid, that you're trying to force that square peg into the round hole. And so that really aligned with our desire. We are currently trying to move servant leaders out of a central model at all times. So we're trying to help each country take over. And again, if they do a good job and don't need us, man, praise God. We don't need to be moving forward. I'll go greet at Walmart, whatever. So the tendency with moving us with Anchor Latin America, you giving us liberty to do that. In the beginning, so much of this has been, we're not sure what this is going to look like. We have, certain rails we want to stay within philosophically and theologically, but we don't know where this is going to go. So when COVID hit and we were already ahead of the curve, we at that point in time, we were offering the 3 certificates: the Bible Foundations, the Ministry Leadership, and the Biblical Counseling. It just took off, especially the Biblical Counseling during COVID. It just took off. And so we were seeing our numbers increase progressively, and then into spaces and places we had never ever intended to go. And so it's always been a tension for us because we desire to be involved in relationship with the local church and not just provide education. But God has seen fit to disperse us and move us through some tension in that way. So, like for example, right now we're in, I believe, the students that are currently in Anchor are from 8 different countries. We have almost 100 students in this round of courses. Our courses run, like yours do, 10 weeks. We follow very much the same architecture and model. We try to move it and push it back into the space of the local church where we want to create an opportunity where they feel competent, that they can mentor and facilitate their own people. We understand that many don't have the capacity to create content or to teach all content. And so within the confines of some of these certificates, if they feel comfortable to teach them on site live, man, we encourage that. And then they can tag on to a modified paradigm where they can do a piece online and still get their certificate through Anchor, which has been great because you've given us the ability to wiggle and move in a space that's been flexible for local churches instead of saying, no, you have to do it this one way. If not, then you can't do it at all. And so that's been, we've seen guys take the courses on solar radios and the material and go and train that way. So we've seen a little bit of everything, trying to make it, flexible and available. So in doing that, pastors have really been liberated to say, I might not feel comfortable teaching, team dynamics, or I might not feel good about teaching Old Testament, but we have that already online, so you can help facilitate it. So we've taken these guys through courses so they get comfortable and understand, and then they can facilitate it, but they don't have to teach it, which opens up a new door. I can facilitate that. I can answer questions. I can work on the character and the skill levels, and you guys are handling the head. Great, I can do that. So that's opened up a whole new venue for us to be able to partner with local churches to do that. And so go ahead.
I was going to say, early on, when in my dialogue with the Lord of what in the world is this, what does the amplify the disciple making mission of the local church globally mean? There are two things that really he impressed in my heart. One was most American institutions that even desire to invest internationally export the totality of their model, which includes exporting American talent to teach, which is amazing if it works, but also in doing so, exporting the American cost. And they may fundraise and diffuse the cost in some different ways. But when you look at the purchasing power across different countries, even the 8 different countries that you're navigating in, it is different from country to country and region to region.
Right.
And so he really impressed on me the idea of saying, what happens when you localize everything? Because the second thing is exporting American talent without the understanding of what the front line looks like. Leaves that coaching, that the hands part of it, kind of out in left field. There isn't understanding of how to help somebody metabolize something when you don't know the world that they're in. And so, we've had the opportunity because of the servant leader partnership to localize to the nth degree all of those dynamics and raise up as opposed to export. And I think that's the unique dynamic that that the Lord has allowed and helped us discover, manifest along the way, like whatever word you want to throw on that.
Yeah, I was just at a church this past weekend and reporting as a missionary. And one of the things that I think, because of my temperament and mentality, I don't stop to reflect. And so, the whole idea of processing life biblically, recognizing where God is at work. And as I threw up some pictures and started to tell some stories, it was one of those moments you're like, oh, wow, I can be super critical of our model and super critical of things not going certain ways. But then you stop and look and say, wait a minute, look what God has done. And so David Soto is one of those examples, right? So Vanessa, we empowered Vanessa to be the first director of Anchor Christian University in Latin America. And she was single gal. She has her doctorate, highly competent. She did a great job, but she gets married and wants to go have a family. Praise God. So in that mix of that tension of what's next, well, we already had people that are in the pipeline that are going through the training. They're reflecting the DNA and the philosophy, have solid theology, and are willing to open up new doors and take risks. And so then you got a guy like David Soto, who's done multiple certificates with us. He's been involved in doing the on-site training now for a few years. He's part of a church planting team that is reflecting our DNA. We're helping them because they're part of servant leaders. And so, David, would you take over as director? You have all these qualities. And so he steps in. Would have been easy for me to say, we need to find an American guy, or I need to take it over. For example, that'd be the safe piece, right? I'll take it over for a while. But I mean, we're all about taking risks and moving it out, and having that permission from you guys, right, to share that same perspective has been liberating. And say, okay, David, let's move with this thing. Let me help open up the door for you and make this possible.
And that really, like, when you get to the mission of education and Christian higher ed, education in general, my personal philosophy is God has a purpose that he built into everybody, and there's a path to potential. And our job as educators, as disciple makers, as, fill in the blank, is to steward that process for the piece that we have and we've been given. And so to say, well, okay, we need to do this. We need to step in and take this over, as opposed to we need to create a system that actually does that in layers and generations, is kind of antithetical to the mission and purpose of things. And so, and that's our shared DNA organizationally, and why this thing has worked, I think, over time. And we're just I feel like we're just at the beginning of what God has in mind for this thing overall. So, and again, we could dive into the corners of that. And I think we do. I would love to have David on at some point and, figure out how to do that, because when in the handoff meeting just a couple of weeks ago, I asked him what his vision was for the next steps. Where are we at? And what are the next steps? Key in leadership, transition, and whatnot. And his humility and his heart and his determination and his well thought out plan for what's next, to build relationally, to firm up the floor on the foundation that Vanessa led to, and really get ready, get about the business of the next steps, was stunning. Like, I don't think I expected that clearly articulated vision, and just the resolve in his eyes and the Jesus in him kind of coming through was pretty spectacular. So without digging into all the rest of the corners, again, we could talk for a long time. Last piece here, having walked the journey you've walked, in all of the different seasons, in all of the different transitions, as a disciple maker, ministry leader, husband, father, etc. If you could go back and have a conversation with your 19-year-old self, one or two pieces of advice that you'd give 19-year-old Cam.
First, I guess, seek to be self-aware. Know yourself. I don't think I took enough time to understand how God put me together, both strengths and weaknesses, tendencies, upbringing, temperamental tendencies, my leadership style. All that stuff would have saved me and others a lot of pain and a lot of difficulty. It would have saved my wife and my family. So I think, being self-aware is critical. Sometimes we're afraid of that because it sounds very psychological or something that is other than what we're supposed to. But the greatest strategic thinker of all times is God. And so he's created with great intention and purpose. And so he put me together. He permitted me in the context and the family and my upbringing. He permitted my education, all for a purpose. And sometimes I can get away from that or get ahead of that. And I did in my beginning years of ministry, and become, fruit or purpose or objective driven. And in my natural tendencies, you can cause a lot of chaos and harm. So be self-aware. The other piece is, don't be afraid of assignment changes. I think we were taught to elevate faithfulness as a location. And so the idea that you are only deemed faithful if you stay in one place. And I think what's been revealed to me is that over time, God has helped me see, no, I have a call on your life. I want you to do a work for me in my kingdom, and I've geared you, I put you together with your talents and your gifts and your passions, all that stuff. But I can change your assignment, and that's okay. And don't worry that the assignment change will come with my power and my provision. It'll be okay. And sometimes I messed around trying to figure out why he was changing my assignment a little too much, to the point where I struggle with, wait a minute, that's not being faithful. Or I had in my mind what I thought I should be doing, and God pivoted me, and I thought, whoa, that's not what I want to do. I shouldn't do that. And so releasing, I go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 3, when Paul is with a struggling church, and he's trying to level them out on the gospel. Chapters 1 and 2 and chapter 3, he comes to them and says, you guys are, one of you is choosing Apollos, one's choosing Paul. And Paul says, both Paul and Apollos are servants. We're on the same level playing field, as we have one master who tells us, and he uses the word, at least in the ESV, that God gives the assignment. And it doesn't mean that you're more important than the other guy. He gives the assignment, and then he goes on and says, and he produces the fruit. So the assignment isn't based on the productivity of the individual. It's based on God's provision working through that individual. And so that gives comfort. It gives peace, and all of the ins and outs and transitions of life.
That's awesome. And I think that is a really hard thing to see early in the journey. Because you're kind of getting a sense of mission and purpose, and where you're seeing fruit. It is easy to say, well, it's kind of transactional. Input with some faithfulness equals outcomes, therefore and there's this flip over of the gospel that happens in that little rational dynamic. And those of us who are directional and leaders are maybe a little more susceptible to that.
Right. Makes you feel insecure, right? Or incompetent.
Mm-hmm. And when things are quote unquote working, it makes you feel very competent and valuable.
Right.
And
so right on.
Anyway, well, good. I really appreciate your time. I know you got a lot going on. Thanks for taking a little bit of time and just unpacking your journey, highlighting servant leaders. Again, I feel like we just kind of scratched the surface of it, but hopefully people catch a vision for what you're doing. We didn't even talk about Missions Academy or internships, cross-cultural, all of that fun stuff. We'll have to save that for another day. But thanks a lot for your time, and blessings in the next steps.
Thanks, Ben. We appreciate you very much, and Anchor, and all the partnership blessings that we received. So it's been a privilege.
Likewise. All right. We'll catch up with you soon.